clay tablet sits in a museum collection, copied and recopied by scribes who never saw the city it talks about. Most people would walk right past it, but this tablet says something that should not be possible. The first empire in human history, erased in what reads like a single season of collapse. The text does not blame an enemy army or a sickness, it names the force that did it. A god who went silent, and the people he sent down from the mountains to finish the work. 4,000 years later, the soil under Syria agrees with the tablet. It was around 2300 before the Common Era, and a man named Sargon had just done something no one had done before. He took a group of city-states in southern Mesopotamia, cities that had spent hundreds of years fighting each other over water and land, and he hammered them into a single state ruled from one capital. That capital was called Agade. We spell it Akkad today, and we name the whole empire after it. At its peak, it controlled something close to 30,000 square kilometers, a full-time army, a web of scribes and land measurers and tax collectors, and grain stores large enough to feed cities through a bad year. For about 100 years, nothing on Earth could match it. And then it was gone, not weakened, not made smaller. Gone, in a way that left the people who came after grasping for an answer. The answer they reached for is the tablet we are talking about. Scholars call it the Curse of Agade, sometimes the Cursing of Agade. It belongs to a Mesopotamian type of writing called Naru literature, where a famous king is dropped into a story built to teach a lesson. In this case, the king is Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, and the greatest ruler the empire ever had. The text was written down in the time that followed the collapse, during the time of the kings of Ur, and copies of it turn up again and again in the clay records of the schools where scribes trained. Students learn to write by copying it. That detail matters. This was not a hidden text, it was a common one. For hundreds of years, young Mesopotamians were taught to read using the story of how their world ended. The story does not start with a battle. It starts with silence. According to the text, the great god Enlil, the head of the Sumerian gods, the god of wind and storm, simply took his favor away from Agade. He stopped blessing the city. Worse, he banned the other gods from entering it. To a Mesopotamian, that was the end, written in advance. A city with its gods gone was a city already doomed. And here is the part that gives the story its strange power. Naram-Sin does not know why. He has no idea what he has done to lose the god's favor. So he does what any king of his age would do. He prays. He asks for signs. He waits for an omen that will tell him how to fix it. The omen never comes. For 7 years, by the text's own account, he waits, almost giving up hope, asking the heavens a question that goes unanswered. Then he makes a decision, and it is the decision the whole tablet is built around. Tired of waiting, furious at the silence, Naram-Sin gathers his army and marches on the holy city of Nippur. Nippur was not a war target. It was the holy center of the whole region, and at its heart stood the Ekur, the temple of Enlil himself, the single most holy building in Mesopotamia. Kings bragged about taking rival cities. No king bragged about this. Naram-Sin tears the temple apart. He sets tools against its base. He pulls down its walls until, in the words the scribes used, the temple lies fallen like a soldier cut down. He strips the gold and the silver and the copper and hauls it away like grain ready for shipping. A warning had been sitting in front of him the whole time. The silence of the god was the warning. He read it as an insult instead, and he answered the insult with axes. What comes next is the part the tablet was really written to give us. Enlil's answer. The god does not send a flood, he does not send fire. He looks toward the mountains in the east, and he calls down the people who live there. The text names them. The Gutians, a mountain people who did not worship the Mesopotamian gods, who were not counted as part of the settled land, who the scribes describe, on purpose, in words that made them sound less than human. They wrote that these people had the minds of humans, but the instincts of dogs and the faces of apes. There is nothing fair about those words. They are the words of people writing about the thing that destroyed them, reaching for ways to strip it of anything human. You write about an enemy that way only after the enemy has won. The Gutians come down out of the mountains in great numbers, the text says, spreading across the plain like a net thrown over open ground. Nothing gets past them. Messengers stop traveling the roads. Boats stop moving on the rivers. The lifelines of the empire go quiet one by one. And then the land itself turns. This is where the tablet stops sounding like a myth and starts sounding like a report. The rivers dry. The fields stop giving grain. The storehouses, those great grain stores that held the empire together, stand empty. Hunger spreads. The text notes prices climbing as food disappears, the kind of detail you do not make up for a lesson story. People who study the text have pointed out how solid the destruction feels, how much it reads like a real record. The gods leave the city. And you can measure that leaving in dried-up canals and empty fields and silent docks. Sit with the shape of that for a second. Agade goes quiet. The rivers fail. The grain withers. The people scatter. A foreign mountain people moves into the gap. That is the chain the tablet gives us, in that order, written down by scribes who blame the whole thing on the anger of Enlil. For a long time, that was where the story ended. A piece of religious writing, a lesson about a king's pride, a warning about what happens when a ruler sets himself above the gods. Historians read it as a political message, written by the family of kings that replaced the Akkadians, to remind everyone that disrespecting the gods gets you erased. Useful, colorful, and not really history. The Curse of Agade was a story about a god's anger, and gods do not show up in what we dig out of the ground. Except the Curse of Agade is not the only text that tells this. The same collapse echoes through a whole family of linked poems, the Mesopotamian city laments. These are poems written as sorrow for fallen cities, and they describe the same kind of ruin in the same kind of words. Storms sent by the gods, cities emptied, temples thrown down, people driven out into a land that no longer feeds them. Different cities, different scribes, sometimes different enemies named at the gates, the Gutians in one, the Elamites and the Sioux people in another. But the basic event is the same. A thriving society in southern Mesopotamia comes apart in the space of a generation or two, and the people who survive write about it as the chosen act of an angry sky. When several separate texts, written in different cities by different hands, all tell of the same disaster in the same stretch of time, you stop reading it as one writer's made-up story. You start reading it as memory. The most detailed of these laments are not even about Akkad. They are about the fall of the great city that rose after the Akkadians and then collapsed in its turn about a century and a half later. The lamentation over the destruction of and the lament for Sumer and are some of the most haunting poems to survive from the ancient world, and they describe end the same way the Curse of Agade describes Akkad's. A storm sent by the high gods, Enlil and Anu, sweeping the land. The city emptied. The streets and the gates left silent. Foreign peoples, the Elamites and the Highland Sioux people, pouring through the broken walls. The city's own goddess begging in vain for the ruin to stop. Different century, different capital, different enemy at the wall. The same machine turned against the same kind of place. That repeating is the clue. The scribes did not reach for the storm sent by the gods story pattern once. They reached for it again and again, every time a great Mesopotamian city came apart, because the thing kept happening to them. The story pattern survived because the disaster survived. Something in that land kept knocking down the biggest cities people could build, and the only way the writers had to explain it was the anger of the sky. By the generation after Naram Sin, that memory was turning into fact on the ground. The empire broke apart. The kings who followed could not hold the land their grandfathers had taken. Solid written records thin out and in some places stop altogether. Historians call the stretch that follows a dark age, a time when the lights of government dim across Mesopotamia and the steady stream of dated, sealed clay tablets slows to a trickle. The most powerful state the world had yet seen did not fade slowly over hundreds of years. It dropped. So the question is the one the scribes themselves could not answer. What actually went quiet? What was the real force the tablet dressed up as the silence of Enlil? The answer did not come from a library. It came from the dirt. In the 1990s, a scientist who digs up the past, named Harvey Weiss, was digging at a site in northeastern Syria called Tel Leilan. 4,000 years ago, this was a busy Akkadian city in the empire's northern grain belt, the part of Mesopotamia that fed itself on rain rather than on canals. Weiss and his team dug down through the city and found what you would expect. Streets, walls, workshops, the layered remains of a place where people lived and worked and rebuilt for generations. The city had freshly built walls to keep enemies out. It had just reworked the way it grew its grain. It was, by every sign in the ground, doing well. And then, directly on top of the last lived-in floor, the team found something that did not belong. A layer of fine, wind-blown dust, about a meter thick, with no sign of people inside it at all. No pottery, no tools, no rebuilding, no bodies. Just dust, settling over an empty city, year after year, for a very long time. The people did not fall in a battle, and they did not drop where they stood. They left. And after they left, nothing came back for hundreds of years except the wind. Weiss and his colleagues read that dust layer as the fingerprint of a drought, not a dry season. A megadrought, a sudden and harsh turn to dry weather that hit around the year 2200 before the Common Era and held for something like 300 years. The rain that fed the northern fields failed. The crops failed with it. And the people of Tel Leilan did exactly what starving people do. They left a city that could no longer feed them and went looking for water somewhere else. The best counts run as high as 28,000 people walking away from a single site. Not far away, the great city of Tel Brak shrank to a small piece of its old size, losing as much as 3/4 of its land. The people who left did not simply fade away. They tracked the water. The ones who lived drifted toward the river valleys and the marshes in the south, the few places where water still gathered, crowding into the shrinking strip of land that could still grow food. The northern grain belt, the rain-fed heart that had made the empire rich, emptied out and stayed empty. This is the force the tablet could not name, because the people who wrote it had no word for it: climate. Scientists who study the Earth now have a name for it. They call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, after the roughly 4,200 years that separate us from it. It was not a local dry spell. Records pulled from cave rock, lake beds, and the mud on the ocean floor show the same mark spreading across the Near East, North Africa, and South Asia at the same time. The big seasonal rains weakened. Rain in the region fell by 1/3, in some places by half. The shakeup was strong enough and wide-reaching enough that Earth scientists eventually used it to mark the start of a new chapter in Earth's history, the start of the age we are still living in right now, the one they call the Megalaion. In other words, the same drought that ended the Akkadians was seen as big enough to split the Earth's timeline itself. The collapse of the First Empire sits right inside that window. So does the fall of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. So does Big Trouble in the Indus Valley, half a continent away. Whatever happened around 2200 before the Common Era did not pick out just one kingdom. It reached across the whole ancient world at once. Now lay the tablet next to the dirt and read them together. The text says Enlil pulled away, and the rivers dried. The ground clues say the rain dropped away, and the rivers that fed the north ran low. The text says the fields stopped giving grain. The dirt at Tel Leilan says the grain belt was buried under lifeless dust. The text says the storehouses stood empty, and the people scattered. The dig says a city of tens of thousands emptied out under a meter of wind-blown dust. The scribes wrote down a weather disaster in the only words they had. They did not have lab tests and soil samples. They had gods, so when the rain stopped and the empire starved, they wrote that the god of wind and storm had turned his face away. They were writing about weather. They just filed it under anger. That leaves the Gutians, the force the tablet names at the gates. And here, the text and the ground line up almost too neatly. When a powerful state is gutted by hunger, when its army cannot be fed and its roads go quiet and its government breaks down, the borders stop being guarded. People from the edges move into the gap. That pattern needs no god to explain it. It happens every time a strong state goes hollow. The same records that follow the drought also follow outsiders drifting into the weakened land, mountain peoples and herders slipping into land the empire could no longer hold. The Gutians did not need to be a punishment from the gods. They were people taking their chance, walking through an open door. The drought broke the empire. The Gutians simply moved into the ruins and got blamed for the whole thing. There is, of course, another way to read this, and the channel would be letting you down to skip it. Writers who believe in ancient astronauts, most famously Zecharia Sitchin, have argued for many years that the gods of these texts were never just symbols at all. In that reading, Enlil and his fellow Anunnaki were real, solid beings, visitors who ruled early Mesopotamia in person, and the gods pulling away describes a real leaving rather than a change in the weather. Scholars who study these texts do not accept it. They argue the translations are pushed too far, and that the texts read like religion rather than a report of visitors. It is offered here as one way to read it, not as proven fact. But notice what even the most careful reading cannot erase. You are still left with a people who watched their world end and wrote down with strange care the name of the thing they believed was to blame. They did not shrug it off as bad luck. Whatever came for them, they were sure it had a name, and they took the time to write it down. And the timing is the part that should make you stop. The scribes who wrote the Curse of Agade were not writing during the drought. They were writing generations later, reaching back to explain a collapse that already lived in memory. They chose to pin it on the moment a king stood against a god. But the date their story points to, the fall of Akkad, lands inside the same narrow stretch of time the Earth scientists point to for the Megadrought. Two completely different ways of looking, ancient memory and modern weather science, pointing at the same few decades. The scribes got the cause wrong and the timing right. There is one more thing the dirt has not been able to give us: the capital itself. Akkad was the heart of the First Empire. Its name is on the empire, on the language, on 100 years of taking land, and no one has ever found it. People have searched for the city of Agade for more than 100 years, and not a single brick has been found for sure. The capital that ruled the known world is the one big Mesopotamian city we cannot find. It is out there somewhere under the plain, or it is gone, ground down and buried and lost. The empire that vanished so completely it led to a tablet about being wiped out by a god managed to make its own capital disappear along with it. So here is where the tablet leaves us. The Curse of Agade is not the made-up story historians once filed it as, and it is not the word-for-word record the ancient astronaut writers want it to be. It is something stranger than either. It is a disaster, written down as it happened, in the only words the people who saw it had, saved by accident, because school children needed something to copy. Lay it beside the soil, and the two stories run in step. The rains fail, the rivers drop, the grain withers, the cities empty, the outsiders come, the state falls. The scribes watched all of it and reached for a god. The dust under Syria says they were watching a drought. What no one can fully explain is why the rain chose that exact century, why the most powerful people alive were the ones it emptied, and why their own record of it reads less like a guess and more like a name. The tablet says Enlil looked away, and a civilization ended. Read the soil under Syria, and a silent god turns out to be the closest thing Bronze Age words had to the word for a megadrought. The force the Akkadians named was real. Whether weather is the whole of what they named, or only the part we have since learned to measure, the tablet does not say. It holds to one thing across 4,000 years, that something looked away and that a whole world went with it. And the dust that buried their empire is still out there, settling over a capital we have never found, one quiet year at a time.